So the title of the lecture is Constitutionalism and Democracy. But before I start, one remark is necessary, is to stress that this question is usually dealt with from a normative point of view. People ask, is constitutionalism compatible with democracy? Or a variant of this question is the rule of law compatible with democracy? And people respond according to their political and moral preferences, and they respond sometimes that democracy is preferable to constitutionalism, and other people say that the law should prevail over the will of the people. And we have now, with these populist movements, we have an example of such a discussion, a tension between constitutionalism and democracy. Presently, you may have heard of Marine Le Pen, who is the extreme right leader and who is a candidate, a possible candidate for president of the Republic. And Marine Le Pen has just been sentenced to a prison sentence, and she has also been sentenced to ineligibility. So she cannot run. And she claims that the judges are usurping a power, that what counts is electoral, is popular suffrage, and she will run, and she represents millions of voters, and so therefore the judges and the law should not prevail over the popular will. So I'm not going to argue from that normative point of view. I'm not going to ask whether democracy, popular sovereignty should prevail over the law or vice versa. I shall only discuss this from a descriptive point of view. How is this possible? This is possible if you take the point of view of the meta language, that I will consider the language of legal theory as a description of a language object, which is constitutional and legal doctrines. And these, I must remember to switch off my phone. Sorry, I haven't done that. And now it's a fact. So I will try to understand what the doctrines are about these matters of constitutionalism and popular sovereignty or democracy or whatever. And I shall do that from a point of view which is a higher point of view, the meta language, and I will look at the logic of these discourses that I'm going to describe. So I shall analyze the internal logic to discover the reasons that have led to these doctrines, and I will look at the logical and argumentative consequences that follow. Today, it is generally thought that the two ideas of democracy and constitutionalism or rule of law coincide, but this has not been always a received idea. Let us remember that in the 18th century, at the time of the Enlightenment, the the founding fathers of the American Constitution and also the French Revolutionary of 1789, they wanted a constitution. It was a constitutionalism, not with these words, not with this term, but it was constitutionalism. And but they did not want democracy. Democracy was something which was not highly regarded. There is a famous saying by Benjamin Franklin that what is democracy? It is two wolves and a lamb discussing what they are going to have for lunch. So democracy means the power of a majority over a harmless and a minority. And in a very concrete way, democracy is the power of the vast majority of the people who are poor over a small minority of the rich, who nevertheless ought to be protected against that measure. So democracy is a danger, it was seen as a danger. But today, and I will come back to the definitions of constitutionalism and democracy, but today the ideas are considered inseparable. Let us remember that at the time of the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall, and the fall of the Soviet Empire, many new countries started devising constitutions with the help of Western experts. And what was the requisite? They wanted a constitution with democracy, the rule of law, and a market economy. These were the three requisites. So the idea is that these ideas are, these three notions, these three requisites are linked together and inseparable. This idea is still prevailing, but there are a certain number of difficulties. I just mentioned that the judges who exercise some degree of control over laws made by the people, they are not elected representatives of the people. So we see a conflict, a possible conflict immediately between the idea that laws in a democracy are made by the people or by representatives of the people, and the fact that in our Western democracies today, we have some degree of control over the representatives of the people, and this can be felt as a control over the people. I just mentioned Marine Le Pen, but you find many other examples, as Hungary is one, and in the United States these days with the election of Donald Trump, you see officials claiming that judges should not be able to exercise any form of control over elected representatives of the people. So these ideas are the same, and this shows that the concepts that people use for constitutionalism or for democracy are not identical. There are various concepts, and some clarification is necessary. I will have to define and redefine these terms all over this in the course of that lecture, but let us start with some very, very basic definitions, and then we should be able to proceed. First, constitutionalism. As you know, as everybody knows, there are several notions. Well, basically, the idea is that a constitution is something, a good thing. To the point that Article 16 of the French Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of 1789, Article 16, says that a society without a separation of powers has no constitution. And this means that it doesn't mean that it has not a good constitution. It has no constitutional laws at all. This is the definition of a constitution. A constitution is some division of powers between several organs or several authorities. That is the definition of a constitution. Why is it good to have a separation of powers? Why is it good? Well, because it is a safeguard of liberty. According to these 18th century doctrine, because liberty is understood as political liberty. What is political liberty? You go back to Montesquieu, and Montesquieu says that political liberty is the security that we have when we obey the law. So it is, liberty is not against the law, it's not a limitation of the law. Liberty is just submission to the law and to the law only. Why is that liberty? Because liberty is the ability to choose the conduct that one is going to have. Liberty is the capacity of choice. And if I know the consequences of my actions, if I know, for example, that this action is prohibited and punished by law, then I'm able to refrain. If I don't know in advance what the consequences will be, then I'm not free. So this is the definition. And with this definition of liberty, there is no really problem with democracy, because it is compatible with any kind of political system. This political liberty you can get even with an autocracy or an aristocracy. Why? Because if the autocrat does not change the law every time, then I will be submitted to the law and I will still have my political liberty, enjoy my political liberty. So things become a little more difficult if you introduce another form of liberty than this political liberty. Benjamin Constant made a distinction between the liberty of the ancients and the liberty of the moderns. The liberty of the ancients was the liberty of the Greeks, in Athens, where liberty was the ability of citizens to take part in the formation of the law. So this is another form. And democracy is precisely that form of liberty, another form that different from the political liberty that I mentioned before. And that liberty then, which is identical with democracy, cannot be combined with autocracy or with aristocracy. It cannot even be combined with any form of mixed government, because it requires democracy. I should be, in that case, liberty is the fact of being submitted to law, but only to laws that I have contributed to producing myself. This is what political liberty. Now, so this is a new form of constitutionalism, and so we will not, it would not be necessary for us to deal, because the modern form of democracy, the problem now is between new constitutionalism and democracy. Now, another question arises: why is this constitution? Why is a constitution efficient? Why does it work? Why would the constitution be respected and provide those benefits that are expected? Political liberty. Why? Well, I see two models. One model is what I call the mechanical model, and this comes from Montesquieu but also from the American followers of Montesquieu and the French followers of Montesquieu at the beginning of the French Revolution. The best example I can find is James Madison. And James Madison says something like that. I summarize something like, if men were angels, we would not need a constitution. We would not need law at all if men were angels. But unfortunately, men are not angels. So we must make a constitution that will not rely on the virtue of the governing authorities, not on the virtue of the prince, but that will rely on something else. Virtue is rare. It's a rare commodity. But there is another commodity which you find in abundance, and that is selfishness, interests. So you should manufacture, you should organize a constitution that would work as a machine where it will not rely on virtue. Virtue is not the fuel, but it will rely on another fuel, which is the conflict of interests. And the conflict of interest and the balancing of interest will produce something which is not exactly virtue, but which will produce legislation that is good legislation, meaning moderate legislation. How does this work? It works by balancing one power against the other. And Montesquieu finds a model of this in the English Constitution of his time, which has more or less influenced the American Constitution, and to a lesser degree, the first French Constitution of 1791. So you balance. What do you balance? Well, you balance the interest of the nobility with the interest of the bourgeoisie and the interests of the king. And you have this structure of a constitution which has three poles. And since a law cannot be passed without the consent of these three powers, then they will have to make compromise, and legislation will necessarily be moderate. Now, we see that this model, well, can function, but only if you have these conflicts of interest. But you see that in this, and this was very often analyzed and qualified as a mixed government between a monarchical element of the king, of course, an aristocratic element, the House of Lords, and the so-called democratic element, the House of Commons, which was not very democratic, but nevertheless, it was considered a democratic element. So the balancing of these three powers would produce moderation. But then, where's democracy here? There is no democracy. You have only one element, which is called democratic, but the others are not. So the problem, this system is not democratic, and constitutionalism, which is used like that, is not democratic. So there is another model, and we shall mainly deal with that other model. The other model is a normative model. With that model, you rely on a hierarchy of norms. The idea that the Constitution is not only the Constitution, but every norms, there are obligations, and one should obey these norms because a higher norm orders you to obey the inferior norm. The higher norm establishes the procedure for producing the lower norm, and at the same time orders. The Constitution, for example, describes organizes the procedure to produce statutes, and at the same time orders people to obey statutes. So we rely on this obligation. But then, how do you verify? How do you make sure that these obligations are satisfied, are complied with? The answer that is usually given, but it's given late in history, the answer is that, well, you have some checks. The definition of an obligation is sanction. And if there's no sanction, there is no obligation. Sieyès, a famous French figure of the revolution, said that either the constitution is binding or it does not exist, or there is no constitution. So in order for the constitution to be binding, you have to exercise some form of review, of constitutional review. So this model has finally triumphed. In the 20th century, most countries use this model of the hierarchy of norms, and they justify judicial review in that way. And this is the problem with democracy. How can you reconcile this system where the guardian of the Constitution is a court, and this guardian exercises a check over the people or the representatives of the people and is not itself a representative? This is what the Americans call the famous counter-majoritarian difficulty, according to a title of a famous book by Alexander Bickel, 1954, 55, I think. So the basic answers, so I'm going to examine, to analyze a few of the answers which have been given. First answer which says that judicial review is just the consequence of the hierarchy of norms, and it's compatible with democracy for two reasons. The first reason, and here I'm referring to the famous case of Marbury versus Madison, 1803, where for the first time, a court decided that it had the power to review the validity of legislation passed by Congress in the United States. How did Justice Marshall, the Chief Justice Marshall, justify this position? He said that the Constitution is supreme, and the Constitution has been established by the people, and since it has been established by the people, it is in conformity with the will of the people that the legislation should be checked by judges. This argument relies, therefore, on the hierarchy of norms. Every constitution is supreme, and therefore, in order for the Constitution to remain supreme, in order to avoid that that Congress could amend the Constitution by means of ordinary statutes, you must have some kind of review. But here I argue that this is a fallacy. It's a fallacy because it plays on the term hierarchy of norms. It plays on the, well, Marshall does not use hierarchy of norms, but he used supremacy. But supremacy, the supremacy of the Constitution can have two very different and very sharply different meanings. As we know from Hans Kelsen, the hierarchy of norms can be static or dynamic. Dynamic hierarchy means that a norm is valid if it has been produced according to the procedure set by a higher norm. Static means that the norm is valid if it has been, if it has a content that can be deduced from the content of a higher norm. So the Constitution would be supreme from a hierarchic point of view if the Constitution, every Constitution, organizes the procedure for producing legislature. So it is true, Marshall is right on this point. Every Constitution is supreme in that sense. But in a static sense, it is not, every Constitution is not supreme. In a static sense, it means that the Constitution is supreme if a statute is valid only if it is in agreement with the Constitution, with the content of the Constitution. If the content of the statute is deducted from the content of the Constitution. And this is not true for every Constitution. This is true only if a statute whose content is contrary to the content of the Constitution becomes invalid. But norms are not invalid, they are not null and void without the intervention of a judge. They can be nullified, but they are not null. Kelsen says this very clearly, I think, that it's not the same thing to say that something is null and that can be nullified. So statutes can be nullified only if there is judicial review. So therefore, the fallacy is using as a premise the idea of a supremacy that is not a premise, that is the conclusion of the reasoning. If there is judicial review, then it is true that the Constitution will be supreme, but you cannot deduct from the supremacy of the Constitution the possibility or the ability to exercise judicial review. So this kind of fallacy has been repeated many times. I have written a small article about this. It has been repeated, for example, by Kelsen himself, and also by Aaron Barak, the Chief Justice of the Israeli Supreme Court at a crucial moment. So this is the first type of way, and we see that this attempt to reconcile constitutionalism or hierarchy of norms with democracy fails. Second idea, they can be reconciled, well, just because judges do not exercise a real political power. Constitutional review would be undemocratic if the judges could avail themselves of their own personal political preferences over the preferences expressed by the lawmaker, who are representatives of the people. But the truth is that judges, this is true not only for constitutional judges, no judge can simply apply the law mechanically for many reasons. Sometimes the law leaves discretion, and most of the time, the law and this is true, of course, of the Constitution, which is written in a language that is both vague and ambiguous, these texts cannot be applied without an interpretation. And interpretation is an act of the will. It is not a function of knowledge. How do you demonstrate that? Well, you demonstrate it that by showing that whatever, and this is, I'm following Kelsen in part, Kelsen's argument, there is an authority which he calls an authentic interpreter. That authority is the authority that can make a valid decision on the meaning of the words, of the meaning of the texts. That decision is valid because it is final. It cannot be challenged. Of course, there are appeals, but for constitutional courts, there are no appeals. So the decision that is made is valid. The meaning that is given, attributed to the text by the court is the final meaning, even if it goes against common sense, even if it seems to contradict the literal meaning or the functional meaning or the intention, as we may know it, of the lawmaker or the constitution maker. It is always valid. It is always valid. So since the courts have that power, it means they have discretion. And how do they use that discretion? Well, of course, by advancing their personal political preferences, moral preferences, religious preferences, and so forth. And it's sufficient to look at the American Supreme Court as it is today. We know that the composition of the Supreme Court has changed over time. At one time, in the beginning of the 20th century, it was extremely conservative. And then came the time of the New Deal, and Roosevelt threatened the court of packing the court to increase the number of judges and appointing a number of liberal judges. So the court submitted to Roosevelt and changed its jurisprudence. In the 1950s and 60s, you had a liberal court with a liberal majority, with a liberal jurisprudence. And now, since Ronald Reagan, you start to have nominations of very conservative people. They changed their jurisprudence. And today you have, as we know, a majority. So people are extremely conscious in the United States that all this idea that the judge merely applies the Constitution, this is just a fantasy. It's just a fantasy. You cannot apply in a neutral manner. And people are so much aware of that, that part of the political campaign goes around the nomination of justices at the Supreme Court. And this is also true at the local, at the level of states. So if I'm elected president, then, says Trump, I will elect justices who are in favor of abolishing abortion, for example, or who are in favor of favoring religion against secularism. So how does this square with democracy? Well, it does not. And people have tried, there are some attempts to reconcile, nevertheless, the idea that judges have discretion, that they are a political power, that they can check the power of elected representative. And here are a few attempts to reconcile them nevertheless. One of my French colleagues and friend, Dominique Rousseau, claims that he accepts the idea that judges exercise discretion. They don't merely apply the Constitution, they do exercise discretion. But he claims that it is nevertheless democratic because judges on a constitutional court are also representatives of the people. They are not elected representatives, but they are representatives nevertheless. How is that possible? Well, in order to understand that, you have to go back to the French Revolution and to the idea of representation. The notion, the theory of representation that was prevailing at in the revolution and which has remained prevalent in contemporary legal doctrine, especially in the French legal doctrine, but I believe also elsewhere. This idea came from a big debate, very important debate, which took place in the French Constituent Assembly on August the 10th, 1791. August the 10th, 1791. The Constitution had already been almost entirely written. So there were, let's stick to the legislative power. The legislative power was given to two bodies, which is called the legislative body and the king, who had enjoyed a veto power. So in order to pass a law, you needed the legislative body to vote, and then it was called a decree, and that decree was transmitted to the king, and the king consented, and that was a law. So then you have to justify, and the Constitution makers decided to give a justification and said the Constitution is representative, because you have to justify, if the sovereign is the people, how do you justify that the legislative body and the king exercise their power? The reason given, well, the French Constitution is representative, and the representatives, said the project, the representatives are the legislative body and the king. And then the left, especially Robespierre, stood up and says, well, this is not possible. The king is not elected. The king cannot be a representative. And Barnave, who is the main drafter of that part of the Constitution, Barnave replied, and he won. Barnave replied, representation is not about election. There's no connection because otherwise all the civil servants who are elected and the judges who are elected, the lower judges, all the judges were elected at the beginning of the revolution, and the mayors of the local communities, they're all elected. So should they be called representatives of the sovereign people? Certainly not. So how do you recognize a representative? A representative is that authority that exercises the sovereignty of the people. So you're not empowered to exercise sovereignty because you are a representative, but you are called a representative because you already exercise the sovereignty of the people. And this is the case because we have already given the legislative power to the legislative body and to the king. So therefore the king is representative. You see, the argument goes in reverse. And Rousseau, my colleague and friend Dominique Rousseau, well, uses that and say, well, the Constitutional Council exercises discretion, and in exercises discretion, the Constitutional Council, in effect, is a legislator, or at least a co-legislator. He participates in the exercise of the legislative power. Therefore, according to Barnave, he should be called a representative of the people, exactly as the king. This is a very clever attempt. And in this way, Dominique Rousseau claims that we have a democracy, but it's a continuous democracy. Every time the Constitutional Council exercises its control, it exercises democracy. But this does not work very well. It doesn't work very well, unfortunately, because the Barnave's view relied on a notion of representation that was a monistic notion of representation. Whereas our contemporary notion and Dominique Rousseau's notion is a dualistic one. What does this mean? Well, at the time of the revolution, the main text, which is still in force, by the way, Article 6 of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, says that the law is the expression of the general will. The law is the expression of the general will, which means that the general will is not the will of concrete people. It's not, the people is an abstract entity. There is no such thing as a real people. The people is an abstraction, and we call the will of the people the will that has been expressed by the law. The law, every law, is the expression of the general will, but the general will is not the expression of a real people. It's the expression of a will which is of an abstract entity. So you cannot compare the will that has been expressed by means of the statute and a real will of the people, because there is no such thing as a real will of the people. So this is the monistic conception that on which Barnave's views are based. Our view today, when we speak of democracy, we don't speak of the people as of an abstract entity. We mean real people, real citizens. And in that case, in order to have representation, we need to have election. It's only by election that we can see that the people are representative, that somebody is representative because he has been elected by real people. And only in that case can we speak of democracy, and not of a fiction of democracy, of an abstract democracy, attributing a will to an abstraction. We need to attribute, in order to speak of democracy, we need to attribute a will to some real group of people, or at least to a majority of a group of people, or to people who have been elected by this majority of the group. So this is the first type of attempt, saying the court only applies the Constitution, does not say anything else, and the court either does not exercise discretion or exercises discretion but is representative. All these fail. So this is the first type of concept. Second, but I will be much shorter on this second point. When you have two notions that seem to be incompatible, one of the ways is to change the definition of one of the terms. So you change the definition of democracy, and then you will make it, or try to make it compatible. How do you do that? Well, you will say that democracy is not the will of the majority. It's different from the will of the majority. Well, because they would say, well, the will of the majority, this is a dictatorship of a majority over a minority. And the minority ought to be protected, deserves to be protected. So democracy is not only majority power of the majority, it's a set of values, of fundamental values, fundamental principles. And what are these principles? Well, they are usually mentioned in constitutions, but not always. So you have human dignity, you have equality, you have personal freedom, you have all the basic liberties, liberty to move, liberty to express yourself, liberty of thought, liberty of religion, and so forth. Constitutionalism, then, if this is democracy, all these set of values, then constitutionalism is a guarantee of democracy, and there is no conflict. There is no conflict. On the contrary, you will say that democracy and representative democracy is guaranteed by constitutionalism and by rule of law, or by the hierarchy of norms. How is that? Well, because it is the Constitution that proclaims that the people have established and accepted and proclaimed those basic values. And they have done it this explicitly when they have preambles of the Constitution, you have constitutional amendments as the United States, you have declarations of the rights of man and the citizen in France, and similar declarations in other countries. So it is the people, when writing and establishing and creating the Constitution, that consecrates those principles. If you apply those principles, then you are in accordance with democracy. This is not entirely satisfactory either, for at least two reasons. The first reason is that who is the people who established those basic values? And who is the people that I'm subject to when I obey the constitutional court that guarantees those principles? Well, it is the people that first established the Constitution. And the American Constitution, as you know, starts with the words, we the people, we the people. But one of the American great figures of that time, Thomas Jefferson, had this wonderful sentence: the earth belongs to the living. If we are submitted to the people of 1787 as American citizens, or to the people of 1789 as French citizens, I'm submitted to the dead. Why is that democracy? These people died long ago. Maybe the people's preferences today have changed. And they have changed, it is true. We don't have the same preferences. The people of 1787 thought that slavery was perfectly acceptable. We don't think so today. So why should I obey a people of dead men? So this is the first difficulty. Second difficulty is these values, these sacred principles. They are written in words, and as we have seen, these words have to be interpreted, and they will be interpreted by a constitutional court that will use discretion, meaning that they will use their personal preferences. So I will not be submitted to a people, not even a dead people. I will be submitted to the court. There is no democracy. This is the survey. And then there is a further difficulty, and I think I will end with that. The difficulty is about some meta-ethical problems. Democracy has, as Kelsen has shown very well with the parable of Pilatus, democracy rests on a meta-ethical philosophy, which is axiological relativism. If there were something like truth, axiological truth, then there would be no point in discussing laws between citizens. Someone would know the truth, and you don't vote on the truth, you don't deliberate on the truth. Once it is established, it is the truth, it is final. So there is nothing like absolute values from the point of view of democracy. But on the contrary, do you remember the passage when Jesus is brought before Pilatus, and it is Easter, and the crowd may ask for the liberation of a prisoner, and Pilatus asks the crowd, "Whom do you want to liberate?" And they say, "We want to liberate Barabbas," and Barabbas was a thief. And say, but isn't Jesus the truth? And someone says that Jesus is the truth, you should not liberate Barabbas. And Pilatus say, well, what is the truth? What is the truth? And Kelsen says, well, Pilatus is a Roman citizen, he's skeptical about truth, he's skeptical about values, and he's a Democrat. So he submits to the crowd, and the crowd wants Barabbas. Well, let the crowd give this. So democracy is relativism. On the contrary, if you have, on the other side, you have absolute values, it doesn't square with the idea of democracy. So my conclusion is that all these attempts have logical defects, and that you cannot reconcile. You can only, from a meta-linguistic point of view, you can describe these difficulties and show that they are unavoidable. But because we have courts, you cannot avoid trying to justify their existence. You cannot merely say, well, I like courts. You have to say something, but trying to resolve that difficulty, trying to reconcile, you nevertheless fall into many other logical consequences and many logical difficulties. Many thanks for your attention.
Dear Professor, we thank you very much for the time you gave us to give this great lecture. We have now some time for questions and answers. We are sure it was very useful for our audience. John, perhaps you would like to ask the professor a question? John Carlin? Okay, maybe John is out a little bit. Igual si alguien quiere hacer una pregunta al profesor, con gusto la pueden formular en español, en inglés, como ustedes gusten, y les podemos ayudar con la traducción. Mientras yo le hago aquí un planteamiento al profesor. Professor, in your work, The Machine and the Norm, two
Mm,
models of the Constitution, as
mm,
well as in this lecture, you indicate the need for this different conception of the effectiveness of
mm,
constitutions,
mm,
which also impacts the interpretation and analysis of the Constitution.
mm.
How then can the mechanical model be transformed into a normative model, and how does this impact the conception of democracy, Professor?
Yeah, well, excellent. I feel very guilty for having to cut short, and I wanted to say something. I should have said something about the contemporary version of that mechanical model, which is reinserted by way of judicial review. Because if you accept that the idea that a constitutional court is part of the making of the law, of the production of the law, then you see that, and sometimes you use it as a counterpower, a countervailing power, a balancing power. So this is a mechanical model which is at work, but it is not used as a perfect justification, but it is sometimes used. But let me tell you an anecdote. The name Robert Badinter is maybe familiar. Robert Badinter was the president of the Constitutional Council at one moment, and he had to justify a decision that the Constitutional Council had made in validating a statute. That decision had been attacked by the prime minister of the time, saying that judges usurp political power. And Badinter wrote an article for the newspaper Le Monde, and saying that the Constitutional Court, the Constitutional Council is the French equivalent of a constitutional court. The Constitutional Council only applies the law and needs to check on the legislator, because the legislator cannot be without check. Otherwise, minorities will be at danger, and the basic principles will be at danger. But the article which appeared in Le Monde was Le Contre-Pouvoir. The article was published with the title Le Contre-Pouvoir, which was not Badinter's original title. And he was absolutely furious. He was absolutely furious. Why was he furious? Because if it is true that the Constitutional Council exercises a power which can balance the power of the legislator, then it amounts to an admission that it is not purely democratic. So he could not accept that. Moreover, he claims to apply the Constitution, and the Constitution does not say that the Constitutional Council is a counterpower. The Constitution assumes that the Constitution does not exercise any discretion, that interprets the law in a purely mechanical way. And so it's mechanical, not in the sense of mechanical model of the Constitution, it's mechanical interpretation. So Badinter could not accept to have his article entitled Counterpower. So you have this difficulty. Either you accept that you exercise real power, but this you cannot at the same time say that you're applying the Constitution. You have to choose. Does this answer your question?
Yeah. Thank you very much, Professor. John Carlin, my classmate in Genoa, asks me to ask you this question. How should constitutional judges redefine their interpretive function to simultaneously serve as guardians of fundamental constitutional principles and as facilitators of democratic adaptation of the constitutional text in the face of new socio-political realities that generate populist pressures?
Wow. This is very difficult, very difficult. But first of all, you're asking me for a theory of jurisprudential policy. How should one, so there are different questions. How should judges interpret? By what means, by what methods, with what function? And then how should they try to change the institution itself in order to face these dangers represented by populism? There are two different questions. So let me deal with the first question. Of course, there are no safe methods of interpretation because there is no such thing as a method that will allow you, enable you to reach the true meaning, only because there's no such thing as a true meaning. So there are methods that provide, that give some results. And the choice of a method is a political choice. You can see that very clearly in the jurisprudence and the rhetoric of the American Supreme Court justices. Remember the dispute between originalists and functionalists. Originalists, such as Scalia, was the most important person arguing in favor of originalism. Originalism is the theory that the text of the Constitution should be interpreted according to the original intent of the authors of the text. And how do you know the original intent? By taking the words with the meanings that they had at the time in 1787. Look at a dictionary of the 18th century and you will see the meaning of the text. Now, of course, this is not a naive attitude. Scalia was not a fool. He knew perfectly well that the word equality, to take just one example, the word equality in 1787 in the United States did not mean equality between free men and slaves. It did not mean equality between men and women, and so forth. So if you take equality in that sense, it will give you, it will forward a policy which is a very conservative and even a reactionary policy. Now, so, and you could say the same with other functional methods will have different, more progressive effects. So the choice of method is a policy. So I cannot recommend a particular method because I don't know what your politics are. Depend on what your results were. If you're a reactionary, then I would certainly recommend the original intent. If you're American, otherwise, if you're progressive, then I can recommend other methods. Now, some people argue that since principles are always and very often in conflict with each other, you should do a balancing, and you can measure the weight of one principle against the weight of another. You know, in Germany, Robert Alexi, who was in Genoa also last year, Robert Alexi is the greatest advocate of this balancing. I cannot buy that because I cannot see that there is objective weight of principle, and that when you weight, you have to make a decision which principle weighs is heavier than the other. And that decision is, of course, a political decision. So there is no safe way to do that. So methods of interpretation are not the way to. So what is sometimes used to protect the court and protect democracy is a general attitude of the court that will try to defer to the lawmaker in taking not too extreme position and arguing that that we judges are only judges, that we are not in charge of making the laws, and therefore we take minimal decisions, and for important principles, we will defer to elected representatives. This sounds like a bow to democracy. And Scalia also used that, which shows that you can use it for different purposes. For example, Scalia used to say that, well, I'm only a judge, I will not interfere with the lawmaker, and if the lawmaker or the constituent maker does not like my decision, then they can always change the constitution, and then I will be forced to accept. This is an attitude which has been very often advocated. Kelsen has something like that. You bow to the constituent power. The constituent power is the real sovereign, and therefore the judge bows to the constituent power. But this can be used also for conservative purposes, because if the amending procedure is very difficult to use, as in the United States, for example, it's extremely difficult to change the constitution. In France, it is also very difficult to change the constitution. It means that if you bow to the lawmaker, then you will keep the constitution in place as you have interpreted it, So this is the case with the present constitution. But you can always devise constitutions that are without taking away the counterpower of the court, can nevertheless establish checks on the court. mean, the court is a check on the lawmaker, but the lawmaker can also be a check on the court. How can that be done? Well, they can be done by different means. Changing the number of judges, changing the budget of the court, making new rules for the agenda of the court, forcing the court to accept more cases, creating new procedures, new access to the court, etc., etc. There are many technical devices. Also, making the amending procedure easier, or again, having some rules for the composition of the court, having, for example, more politicians on the court and less professional judges. People are, in France, argue that the Constitutional Council should comprise law professors, more law professors. Well, at the moment, there is no law professor on the Constitutional Council. And those who argue in favor of that are mostly law professors. They would like to be members of the Constitutional Council. But if there are law professors, this does not guarantee that the courts will be neutral, that it will not exercise political power. Law professors also have political opinions, and they are not always one-sided. But another way is to have, well, the German and mostly the Italian system are good because the courts are organized and are composed of people who are lawyers by profession. They must have some legal technique and legal ability, but they also correspond to political parties, and these political parties have to, with a two-thirds majority in Germany, in both houses of parliament, the political parties have to make compromise to have judges who will not be one-sided, which does not happen in the United States. So the German system and the Italian system, which resembles a little bit like that, the German system are also much better than the American system, much better than the French system, much better than the French system. So these are these techniques that can be used to keep constitutional courts, leaving them some power, but not excessive power. Not excessive power. And now there is presently a discussion in Germany where the courts have to, there are some vacant seats in the Constitutional Court, and the parties cannot get to agree, as for now, to fill these vacant seats because the extreme right, the Alternative für Deutschland, the extreme right, neo-Nazis, have won many seats, and it's very difficult to have a two-thirds majority to fill the seats on the Supreme Court, on the Constitutional Court, sorry. Without these, so it's very difficult, and the fear is the populist movement. So how do you reinforce the court in front of that danger? I think one of the idea is to to show the people that the court is not malleable to political power, because one of the dangers that the populists will the danger that weighs on the court is what happened in Poland before, what happened in Hungary, what happened in Russia. The populists came into power, they have an overwhelming majority, they change the constitution, or they fill the court with cronies, with friends, and then they have a court that acts exactly how they wish. So the thing in that case is to change the way to appoint one of the way to appoint judges, to have a secure budget for the court, because this is one of the way they cut the salaries. What they did in Poland is have an age limit, so they lowered the age limit for retirement of the judges, so that they could fill the seats with their own friends easily. So you have to have the age limits, which cannot be changed. You have well, there are many gadgets that you can secure the position of the court, to try to secure the position. An absolute security, an absolute guarantee, you will never get.
Okay, Professor, thank you very much. Your answers have been very clear. We greatly appreciate the time you have taken to be with us. Learning from you, your books and lectures is magnificent. I want to thank you again, and we send you warm greetings from Mexico and other countries here in Latin America, especially from the Juarez University of the state of Durango, your home. And thank you again, Professor.
Thank you very much. Next time I come to Durango.
We hope. Thank you. Y
Bye
gracias
bye.
a todas y todos. Hasta luego. Excelente día.